So last weekend, what did you do, Hallie?
I sat in my shower on an audio-only call for theater and told a lot of strangers about my chest dysphoria. So that was fun. And then my cat came and sat in my shower with me. Yeah. Zoom theater.
Amazing. And this is part of the CAB series, the online virtual CAB series?
Yeah,
for Yale.
For Yale.
Yeah, this was the Untitled Bathtub Theater Project through the Yale Cabaret.
I love that so much.
We had audience members in their bathtubs listening to this audio-only stream, and we were, like, guiding them through a bath.
I
sang some songs.
almost bought a ticket for that, and I was like, I have a hard time sitting in my bathtub by myself, so I just decided that wasn't the place for me.
I mean, like, what
But
if
it was
you
a
don't
fascinating idea.
have a bathtub? I don't have a bathtub.
I don't have a bathtub either. I sat in my shower stand. Basic water.
Hi, my name is Frances Pollock,
I'm Allison Chu.
and you are listening to another episode of Miss Opera Music Mister, a podcast exploration of trends and biases in contemporary opera and how they reflect the world at large.
This podcast was developed out of a research project about gender bias in contemporary opera reviews, and we realized that the issues were much more interconnected and sprawling than we could explore in just one academic research paper. So, we turned to our friends, colleagues, mentors, and role models to help us out. Today, we are speaking to two up-and-coming players in the world of contemporary opera scholarship.
I'm Hallie Voulgaris. I use they, them pronouns. I'm a third-year music theory grad student at Yale. I guess in my main academic world, I'm actually a medievalist, but also I really care about opera.
Cool. I'm Alexis Lamb. I'm a composer and percussionist, and new to the opera world, but I'm very excited about what it might mean to reframe the word opera.
Hallie, Alexis, Allison, and I gathered on a crisp October morning to address topics that persistently linger at the back of our minds: opera and gender. Two incredibly wide-ranging yet messy areas of exploration.
So opera and gender, like, where do we start?
I don't even know where we want to start, because I think, like, it's such a broad topic, and yet I don't know if I can really separate the two.
Mm-hmm.
I think, at this point.
Yeah.
Especially the way that contemporary opera has really tried to dive into some of these issues.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, we can start with sort of the Western canon. We were discussing earlier over breakfast that opera has sort of a delightfully playful relationship with gender a lot of times. I mean, like, you have the history of the travesty, you have the history of the pants role.
Castrato.
Yeah, that's less playful.
Less playful. Yeah. Much less playful. But still part of
Yeah,
history.
it's still definitely part of it. So I think that opera in some ways has been incredibly regressive, but in some ways has been, like, you know, pretty broadly accepting of, like, you know, playing with gender on the stage. How do you, as a scholar, how do you feel about that, Hallie?
It feels so complicated because of the ways in which it became so rigid and regressive and is associated with all various kinds of conservatism. That it's, on the one hand, yes, but on the other hand, it's scary and feels close to doing some sort of revisionist history sometimes, you know?
Why do you think it became conservative and rigid? I know that's, like, a really big question.
I just
but...
like blaming the 19th century for everything I don't like. But that's because the rest of the time I'm a medievalist, so...
That's amazing. Blame it all on the 19th century.
Yeah, that's probably unfair.
We here are by no means reductionists, but if we were, it would all be the 19th century and probably Germany's fault.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like a lot of broader societal gender stuff, like the sort of medicalization of homosexuality, is all coming out of this 19th century ideas about gender, and then you get to the psychoanalysis stuff, and for me, that feels like a big time where ideas about gender and what it means is changing a lot into what people who now like to invoke tradition are talking about, and so that's probably why I blame the 19th century.
I know. I'm reading all this sociology right now about the ways that that art's structures and markets form, and so much of it is the labeling and the boxing in and the genreizing of certain things.
Genreification.
Yeah, I don't know.
Is that a word?
But I think gender performs the same way in opera. I mean, sort of up until this 19th century point, there was a lot more. I think acceptance of play with gender on the stage, and then at the 19th century, I think we came to this place where it was all of a sudden very codified.
But it's interesting because that's such a divide from how society thought of women and women's roles, right? So there's all this backlash about women can't compose because they should be part of the private sphere, and all of their singing is relegated to the private salon, and they sing the lighthearted songs, you know. And I think that's so interesting because it's so different than what stage life is like. You know, I really want to go back to Ethel Smyth's The Wreckers and see what the women in that opera were just.
Yeah.
How are they represented?
I love reading about Ethel Smyth because her personal life was wild. I love it so much, and I've been saying recently that I really want a TV show that's trashy in the way the L Word is trashy, but about Ethel Smyth's lesbian opera circle.
Excellent.
And I want it so badly. Someone please make this TV show.
MOC project.
Yes.
Clearly, this is a topic near and dear to our hearts, but it doesn't just affect the way we consider history. It also stands in dialogue with how we think about contemporary entertainment. Operas written over 100 years ago still enter our contemporary conversation, so isn't it time we talk about the way gender is portrayed? Okay, yes, we will admit to dreaming about future lesbian opera TV dramas, but the question isn't irrelevant. We can think about gender and musical theater, too.
Do you think musical theater treats gender in the same way that opera treats gender?
I think musical theater in a lot of ways is more rigid than opera, to be honest.
Because of the commercial aspect?
Yeah, in some ways. Yeah. I mean, I think that we're, of course, and I think I think Hallie is so onto something with this idea of the 19th century. But the idea of musical theater is kind of post 19th century, right? And so at this point, gender is sort of structurally codified within the genre. And even if musical theater is in some way derivative of opera, which is sort of not true, but whatever, we can say it for right now. I still think this idea of gender is something that isn't really pushed back against until much later in the 20th century. What would you say?
I think the really interesting thing about my experiences with musical theater versus opera, first of all, I if anyone actually knows me, they're going to say that I don't like musical theater and I don't listen to opera, and I'm realizing that those are just words in the same way that we say that I'm a classical composer, but I don't think that that's the case at all. So I'm working through that reframing. But I also really appreciate in musical theater how the speaking roles play a part in the gender conversation as well, and I always am. For me, I'm usually more interested in the speaking components of it, but it just feels like the women's roles are maybe stronger because they have a speaking element as well as a singing element in the musical theater versus opera. That's been my recent experience with that.
That makes me think of the Singspiels, and how a lot of those recits were spoken, you know. And I think you're actually right. I think you're onto something because I think the women in Singspiels have more agency than so a lot of times romantic sopranos they don't seem to have a lot of agency.
Right. A little bit more introspection, right? Talking about their thoughts rather than just this is what I'm feeling.
Right.
Let me sing it to you.
But also Frances, I think that your speaking voice, for example, is something that you would maybe think oh, you're probably an alto or a mezzo soprano or something like that, but you are a coloratura soprano. So to me, that's fascinating.
Yeah.
That, if I get to speak to you, I totally get these two different facets of you as an individual, and I really get to hear your true voice as well as your singing voice. I think this is really interesting.
But I do remember when I was younger trying to drive my speaking voice down so people took me more seriously. Like, it's actually not healthy where I speak.
Yeah.
You know, if I was speaking healthily, I would be speaking up here. And I would be supporting on the breath. And I wouldn't crack like a, prepubescent child. Like, all the time.
I definitely do that depending on what I'm wearing, I've noticed.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I've never really, I don't know what my true voice is. Maybe that's why I have such an interest in it in, like, a musical sense. But I feel like if I'm wearing more feminine clothes or, like, a dress or something like that, then my voice will typically be slightly higher.
Voice correlation between character and gender presentation is such an interesting little world. We might think about how in 19th century opera, voice types signified specific characters within a family. So the tenor was the hero, the high soprano was the young girl, the mezzo-soprano was the mother. These voice types were a surefire way of getting to the character type quickly, almost like a stereotype. Yet now in the world of contemporary opera composition, when gender roles and gender identification is much more fluid, the correlation between family role and voice type isn't set in stone. And the sound of the voice seems to be much more important in considering the character.
I'm going to start looking out for this.
Yeah,
I think it's probably
really
true.
But I also think part of it is because of past experiences of being misgendered and, like, feeling the need. Like, when somebody says sir, I'm like, oh, thanks so much. I really appreciate that. And then they look at it again and they're like, oh my god. Whoops. I just care less about that now. But,
Oops. Yeah. That's really interesting. I think that probably totally tracks. Yeah. I know when I'm writing opera, I think a lot about what voice fits the character. For instance, in my opera Stinny, there is this really awful character who rallies a mob to go attack the Stinny family. And I remember having this, like, very, intentional conversation with my mentor who was helping me write the show. Shout out David Smooke. And I was like, this guy has to be a tenor, because he's from a small southern community, and, like, he's trying to prove his masculinity in doing this, and he's been trying to do it his whole life. And so I think that, like, a lot of times the way that I choose a gendered voice is sort of in play with how that voice interacts with society. So I think that's what you're pointing to,
Yeah. It makes me think of sort of like Elizabeth Wood's Sapphonics and adjacent things, and talking about specifically, like, the lesbian operatic voice as this, and, like, there's so much problematic going on there, but and it's at a superficial level, it's kind of like not the sopranos. It's these have these interesting textures, and maybe there's something lower, but it's so much more complicated than that. But it definitely is. I guess you could distill it to something about this voice is queer coded in some way that's, like, obviously contingent to the time and place.
Yeah.
But it totally communicates something.
can I ask what it means to make, like, a gay opera?
Yup. Alexis dove right in and asked the question on everyone's mind. But it's one that's worth pursuing.
How many times I've had to answer, try and answer the question, like, oh yeah, we really want to program your music because it's, like, June and it's, Pride Month, and we want to write, like, we really want to have some, like, queer music or some gay music. And I'm like, well, I don't know what to tell you.
And the sad reality that composers face all the time. More times than I want to count.
And I'm just wondering, because, I mean, a lot of actually what I write is more instrumental and, like, chamber music and things like that. If there really are these more concrete conversations in the opera world of, like, this is a very gay opera, this is a very queer opera, without it necessarily being just the storyline. Like, is there gay music in opera?
Yeah, there's no such thing as gay opera.
Yeah.
There is opera. And, like, and everyone is writing in a, like, in a tradition. And it's a tradition that is not gay, it's a tradition that's musical.
Yeah.
And that identity is so often commoditized as a thing to sell, to make an institution relevant. And that's really frustrating a lot of times.
I think that's why I heard a paper last weekend at a conference, and they, like, totally underscored this idea that there was a genre of gay opera. And they pulled up this list on their PowerPoint slide, and I'm not kidding. It's like 10 operas, at least, written in like the last, between like, I guess like, I'm looking at the list now because I like screenshotted it in the conference. I couldn't believe that they actually compiled this list. And it's all the way from like 1995 to like 2016. And there's just like opera after opera, and they put like Two Boys, they put Paul's Case by Gregory Spears, they put Brokeback Mountain, Fellow Travelers, and like they were so insistent that like this is a genre now.
That is a genre of operas written by gay, white, cis men. So that is not correct. That is incorrect.
But I find it interesting because like it's a plot. Mm-hmm. It's a story. It's a story about people that happen to be gay. Mm-hmm. So does that necessarily make it, like, do we conflate the plot to also be the identifying feature of an opera that has so many other components to it, too?
I mean, how can you boil a genre down to a sexuality without holding space for all of the brilliance and variation that comes with gender and sexuality?
No.
Yeah.
It feels like that's how we're set up to classify media, right? Like you scroll through your whatever your favorite streaming platform is, and there's like under all the genres, you'll have like action, drama, horror, LGBT.
Well, I think that's why all of these operas that were like part of the gay genre were from the last, nearly 30 years, is because it's quote relevant. And so they're using that relevancy in the same way that that we're seeing an uptick in different politicized issues regarding race and other components of gender and
But the question ultimately becomes, does that ever actually broaden the field? Or does that just reinforce a glass ceiling that people have been fighting against forever? And I mean, and I don't mean like since the 60s. I mean, forever.
I kind of think of it in the same way as like, Daniel Radcliffe is never not going to be Harry Potter. Regardless of how old. I mean, seriously, like, if you're a composer and you're saying that, like, I'm going to write this gay opera and you want to just, like, live in that world, then I don't think you're going to be anything but the gay opera composer.
Yeah. Alexis, I think you're so right. I think that the greatest bit of meta casting that I have ever seen was casting Alexis Bledel, who played Rory Gilmore, as the Emily in Handmaid's Tale. Because it was, like, totally this, like, futuristic, dystopic, like, possibility. I'm obsessed. I hate The Handmaid's Tale, but, like, I was obsessed with that casting choice. Because, like, Rory Gilmore finds herself, first of all, as a queer woman, which, awesome. But, like, she also finds herself in this, like, horrible world that ostensibly, like, Yale grads have created, right?
Yeah, I was wondering about this, though, too, because, like, As One got so much publicity. So, like, while we were undertaking our, like, compiling articles for our database, I kept finding articles about As One, but comparatively, like, there were no articles about, like, Paul's Case, or, like, even Fellow Travelers had a handful compared to As One, because As One was done so many times. And I have to wonder if the selling point of As One is not just because, oh, it's a small ensemble, it's easy to put on, but also because it's a topic that happens to be a buzzword topic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's definitely the most cynical way to think about it. I mean, and honestly, like, a lot of the way that I tend to fall into it, I do think that the other things that you said about the operas, like Paul's Case and Fellow Travelers, like, they're a big cast and it's a big ensemble. And As One is a string quartet and 2 singers.
Yeah.
So, like...
It's very doable.
It's very doable. I also think that Mark, Laura, and Kimberly have pushed that opera as far and as hard as they can because they do believe in it.
It's great.
Yeah, it is great. But I think that it's selling on a market that is paying based.
Of course, we are blurring the lines between gender and sexuality, but the premise is the same. Gender and sexuality have become marketing tools that cater towards a certain kind of audience.
Let me flip the pain thing on its head and ask, is there a so-called gay opera that is comedic? And, like, I mean, I think we can say pretty wholeheartedly that a lot of the contemporary operas that are coming out now are not comic. They are like pure tragedy and trauma based.
Mm-hmm. There's the one Sweets by Kate that's written by Griffin Candey, and like they very intentionally set out to write this like lesbian comedy. Cool. That was not about trauma.
I was also going to throw on sort of the popularity of opera drag.
Ooh, good one.
Yeah. Like both playing with gender and just bringing a sort of joy and I don't know, comedic aspect sometimes to like often canonic opera that's, you know, not comic.
Yeah.
So that's sort of different than new works being written that are comedies, of which there are very few. But
Heartbeat does this, right?
yeah, they do like every Halloween.
Yeah.
Usually.
Yeah.
But that also has a bit of a tradition too. That's not a new thing.
Yeah. Can you say more about that tradition?
Yeah, I don't know anything about it.
I don't know a lot about it. I just know that when I was doing readings for my quals this summer I don't remember, it probably wasn't musicology and difference. It was probably Queering the Pitch. I'm sorry, I don't remember where this chapter was. But there was a chapter that was, the concept was thinking about opera analysis or critique from the perspective of the quote-unquote opera queen. Mm. Specifically a kind of caricature of a gay male opera fan, usually very into the divas, but also being associated with this specific kind of drag opera culture and specifically referencing like going to an opera drag party and stuff. Mm-hmm. And so this chapter would have been in the 90s, but it was referencing a thing that was well established already. So I don't know much more of the specifics, but it was fun to read.
Yeah.
I remember you telling me about this.
Yes, I still think you should read it. Like,
I think it's Queering the Pitch that you told me.
We were wrong. It was a chapter by Mitchell Morris called Reading as an Opera Queen in Musicology and Difference. If you're listening to us via a podcast platform and you're interested in these articles that Hallie is referring to, check out our YouTube version of this very podcast, where you'll find links and full citations. But back to gender. Where else can we find gender and sexuality represented in opera positively? Does opera always need to be traumatic and dramatic and negative? No, not if we consider what satire has done for the genre when it is done with intention and care.
Well, this is when we're getting into like the brilliance of satire, you know?
True. Yeah.
Which opera actually has done, you know? And it's not all tragedy and it's not all like pain and like sort of devastation. It's like, let's actually put together a really clever critique of the society that is putting on this production. You know, you think about Brecht and you think about Weill and, you know, Shostakovich was another really great figure who, and I think, I don't want to speak too boldly about this, but I actually think that it takes a really special artist to be able to pull that off. You know, an artist that has actually sat and thought about like all the problems with society.
And how to satire them.
And how to satirize them, yeah.
Yeah, that's true. Like, so I was thinking about, like, talking about male queerness and the world of criticism, too. Because so many of the opera critics or arts critics out there right now, the prominent ones, are white, gay men. Mm-hmm. And they're the ones who are writing lengthy opera reviews and are contributing, like, literally in our database, I think the majority of them
90%,
are
yeah.
white, male, gay critics.
Yeah. There's nothing wrong with being white, male, or gay. It's just that when it becomes a monolith, like,
right,
it becomes a monochromatic. Literally, you know?
And Danilo made a really great comment last weekend to us about how, like, fashion has this problem, too, where, you know, there's a lot of white gay men who are dictating what women wear and how they look, right? And so I think it's really interesting to pose the question, like, so what's the parallel in music?
Yeah.
You know, what does it mean if gay men, critics, directors, choreographers, writers, are also controlling or having the majority say in this field?
Mm-hmm. I think a lot about the stories that we inherit and where they're generated from. And one thing that we've seen historically is that women, this is sort of like
the most second wave, like, old-fashioned, like, version of feminism, but, like, it, like, frankly, like, it sort of illustrates your point really nicely, is that, like, in starting with this idea of 19th century opera, like, you know, women sort of became, like, Madonnas or whores. And that is something that women didn't like, you know?
Surprise.
But surprise! like women were like, we are more than that, you know? And I think because when a field becomes sort of monochromatic, that's what you fall into. It's that, like, you are being presented a story over and over and over again by, like, one group of people.
But I think also in every level, right? Not just, the people who are writing the operas, but also the people who are writing about the operas, 100%. The critics who are, you know, publishing in the newspapers and trying to talk about maybe a story that's, like, female-centered, and then not being able to really, you know, dive into the details of, like, what's going on the stage because there's no relation.
Right. Yeah. Shout out to the critics, and at the same time, I think it's important that that field broaden and diversify in the same way that any other field needs to broaden. It'll just make the field stronger.
I think there's also a difference between the push for diversifying, like, whose ears and, you know, opinions are we showcasing, but there's also because so much of reviews, especially when they're so short and in, like, a big newspaper or something, does kind of boil down to, is it good?
Right.
And so one hopes that diversifying the field would bring with it a, like, deconstruction of and unpacking of those value systems, but I think that doesn't always happen and maybe is so delayed down the road. So it feels like, yes, there's that, but I think also the big critics maybe need to unpack some of those value systems a little more for us.
Oh my god. Absolutely.
Yeah.
How do you feel about, like, the question of, is it good? Like, sorry, Hallie.
I mean, like, you can never really answer it, right? You can say, like, well, I liked this thing, or X, Y, or Z was, like, technically well executed, or, like, I think that this plot point was misogynistic, but the music was good, you know? Like, I feel like happens so often, right? You see a show and you're like, oh, that one aria was gorgeous, but also, like, this whole framing was a little bit...
Right.
So...
Yeah.
You know, it's who's to say, is it good? And unfortunately, I suspect that a lot of these critics for writing for major publications I have not done this, but I suspect there's more of a pressure to give a more concise answer to that.
Yeah.
Even if it's, like, on the one hand this, on the other hand this, that's still not getting into the level of granularity.
Oh my gosh. And then I feel like it happens both ways, right? Like, you can completely trash a critic can completely trash a piece, but I also think about, like, the backlash that pieces like Hamilton are receiving now, because they were, like, unilaterally, like, lauded as, like, the greatest thing since anything, sliced bread, anything. Yeah. And, like, they should receive some, like, critical thought, right? Like, these pieces that critics, I mean, I think about one of my favorite things that has come out recently, I saw it at Yale, and then I saw it twice on Broadway, was Slave Play. I think that piece is brilliant. I think Jeremy is, like, one of the best, like, playwrights that I personally know. I also think that piece deserves some pushback, you know, in some ways. And honestly, it got it online, you know, with people who brought up some very legitimate points, but overall, the people who were in charge decided that it was a societal good.
But that's one of the complexities that exists in opera or musical theater or plays that does not necessarily exist in, like, concert music otherwise. You know, it seems to me like because there are less variables in the larger collaborative process of, you know, there's composer plus librettist plus producer plus lighting designer plus set designer plus director plus, like, XYZ, right? Whereas it might just be, like, composer plus performers plus maybe conductor or director. And so it seems like a more cut and dry thing, but even then, you know, a lot of times I've found that, like, critics are so good at just flowering their vocabulary in a certain way that, like, rides that line of, like, well, maybe this was good, but I'm not gonna say it exactly that way, because then it's kind of like a weatherman who, like, you know, they don't need that high of an accuracy rate. They just kind of tell you what's going on, and you have to see for yourself. And I think that's the biggest thing. I don't know if I could ever go into an opera and say, like, I absolutely hated it or I absolutely loved it, because there'd be something on both sides that I would appreciate, I'm sure.
Yeah, conversely, I think that it takes a pretty long time to love a piece in the ways that I think that some people love operas.
Yeah.
You know, like, I mean, I think about, like, Aylin Perez's recording of Donde Lieta. Like, the first time I heard that, I was, like, blown away by it, but I didn't love it as much as I love it now. You know, it's, like, the thing that I go back to, and I kind of love every single part of it, and so I think that, like, you can simultaneously, like, experience one thing one time and, like, write it off, but, like, I think it's harder to love it in the moment.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which is a problem if like, people's operas only get mounted one time.
Yes.
You know? Like, that's a big problem.
Or it's only a reading of it or a workshop without the full production.
Right.
Yeah. Or even just really short run. 2 performances, 3 performances, and that's it. Yeah. There's no opportunity to go and revisit the piece and sit with it.
Yeah. I can think of one piece that I have, like, walked away from that I was just, like, completely blown away from the beginning, and that was Julia Wolfe's Fire in My Mouth. Like, that piece, for me, worked as soon as I heard it. But I think that's so rare, and honestly, I don't think that every piece needs to do that, you know?
Yeah, I'm thinking a lot about this moment we're in of Zoom theater and Zoom opera as a catch-all for whatever platform they're using to stream the thing. And how it can be good and powerful, but it's missing. And the same thing with listening to a recording of an opera or a piece like this is the in-person, the sound of it. Like, it's not over my crappy headphones that's been streamed, probably, like, you know, not great quality microphones. It's just so unsatisfying in that very particular sonic way, and the stories can still be very powerful.
Yeah.
But it's still something very different from the sound in a real concert hall or something, and that's sad.
You never thought that, like, what's that guy's name? Walter Benjamin? Like, you never thought that, like, he would be relevant again, but he kind of is, you know? Like, it just doesn't replace it.
This is Adorno's argument too, isn't it? Like, how transmission over the radio is just not as good. I mean, he has this whole thing about how, like, Beethoven 5, you know, transmitted through the radio is not Beethoven 5 anymore, because it's been just, like, I think he calls it, like, atomized, you know, and it's not the same.
Yeah.
I mean,
but what if that's
that to ends that we might disagree with. But no, there is definitely truth that they are different things.
Yeah.
But again, what if that's the only way that you actually get to produce that material? Like, we can say, you know, Beethoven 5 is no longer Beethoven 5 when it's put through radio waves, but, like, what if the purpose is to have it on a medium that is like a Zoom or a streaming service? Or what if it is, again, because of the circumstances that we're in right now, the only opportunity that you get to have this one-off production, and then and then the company has to move on.
I mean, it's certainly better than nothing.
Or even, like, the only opportunity to record. Right? Like, I keep thinking about, so earlier we were talking about submitting applications for commissioning projects and commissioning grants. And, like, I keep thinking about the lack of opportunities to record even, or, like, try and get a new piece that you've written, you know, prepared and ready and for an application submission.
Yeah, totally. Well, and a lot of the other thing that I think makes Zoom a little bit frustrating is a lot of the pieces that are trying to be presented over Zoom are not created for Zoom. You know, so, like, the bathtub theater, like, was for Zoom.
Oh, yeah.
And
it would only work over Zoom.
It would only work over Zoom, otherwise. That sounds illegal to be in someone's bathroom.
Yeah, imagine all the waivers for, like, you're all gonna get naked and get in this row of bathtubs.
Oh, wow.
And I'm here for that
I could see that happening. Yeah.
But I feel like we are not in that place in this country right now to do that live. I do think that what is it that Denis always says, that the idiom, that the genre demands the idiom. And so, like, if something is made for Zoom, it should be presented on Zoom. If something is made to be performed live, I think there is some argument that, like, maybe it should be performed live.
Just wait it out.
I want to focus us back onto gender. I mean, I love this conversation we're having, but I have one more, like, big question I want to ask, and I suspect the answer is yes. But I want to just throw out there, is the field still too binary?
Yes.
And I'd love to, like, hear your takes on, like, what opportunities are out there for people who are female, but also people who are trans or non-binary identifying.
I think Hallie is so onto it with this 19th century point. Like, I'm just thinking about that forever.
19th century.
I think opera was more playful with gender before the 19th century. Like, I think that this is something that got imposed on it, this binary. Maybe on gender in general, I don't know. Like, I haven't, Hallie is as
I would suspect
shaming.
yes. I would throw a yes to that.
Yeah.
I think a lot of the stuff we trace back to, like, early psychoanalysis and changing ideas about, like, are male and female two separate things or, like, reverse versions of the same thing and blah, 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 blah.
Yeah.
It becomes this very...
That was then, like, placed on everything, right? Like, you have, like, rationality versus, like, emotion. And it's like, shut up.
Would more leadership by people who identify as female or trans or non-binary change this? Like, I'm interested, like, I know this is a problem, right? But I'm interested in thinking a little bit more, especially since now everyone is like, what do we do? What do we do? Like... What do we do, though? But, like, legitimately, how can we actually make some lasting change?
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of separate layers, and some are at the, like, musical form level and sort of deconstructing sort of existing norms, assumptions, things that we use to say this is opera versus something else, this is good opera versus bad opera or any of that. So there's that level of things. But then there is the representation and telling different stories and promoting different directors and all of that, and composers. And I think those are in some ways separate but interrelated issues.
Totally.
The issue of, like, wanting to highlight certain stories and really, like, feature individual voices without having... I mean, I think that we're at the point now with gender that it is... there is no assumption that, like, a trans man will have a mezzo voice or a countertenor voice, or, like, a trans woman will have a baritone voice, or whatever the case may be. It has become so individualized to who you are writing for and what the context of the story is, and if you want to feature those roles, then I think it personalizes the collaborative process, because then you ultimately need to find somebody who you want to work with who fits that role, and if all of a sudden something changes in the process or whatever, it won't be as I don't know, then like the gender is not just the plot, but it's also like the main way that the composer would be writing the piece.
I feel like it needs individual. Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and it also makes me think about ways that it feels like, even if we just narrow that to, like, writing for trans voices, which is obviously not one monolithic thing, but whatever, but, like, topics that should be talked more about in both, like, vocal pedagogy, if we're talking like conservatory vocal training, or if we're talking about composing and, like, when one is learning to write for voice, like, that seems like a thing that you should be talking about. And maybe part of what that accomplishes, not just in promoting trans vocalists, but also maybe just broadening what people think of as a good voice or an operatic voice in general, and accepting a wider range. Because that's, these set voice types are one of the many things that have been handed down to us and might not work for everybody. And, valuing different kinds of timbres. So I wonder if in some ways it's part of a bigger project of unpacking, like, the ways that we value operatic voices. And which voices do we value, which is like...
That's so insightful.
The ways in which gender is written in the canon, it's so right, if you're trying to be very, like, originalist about it, it's so culturally and temporally specific, right? Are we trying to recreate the way that audience would have perceived the gender of these characters? Or are we just gonna put them in our new cultural context and play with how they read now? Seems to be, right, the big debate that they're arguing about in the 90s, too, about dance roles and castrati roles and the whole nine yards, but, I don't know. It feels to me like the more fun thing is to just play with it and make it new in your own. But I know that there are sort of
and
historical,
right?
like research, like as an academic, there are reasons to not do that. But from an artistic point of view, it feels much more like joyful and not agonizing over it and making it new.
Yeah, and to do it intentionally, right? Like to do it with like we are aware that we are exploring gender as it pertains to our own, like, sort of temporally cultural, like, experience right now. But, like, it's not just about, like, using it as a marketing tool or using it as a, like, a thing to, like, gain cultural clout. It's like, let's actually play with this. Let's get in there and, like, radically, joyfully play with it.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Miss Opera Music Mister. If you like what you've heard, please feel free to follow and engage with us on social media. We are on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and would love to talk to you about your thoughts about the contemporary opera scene. Be sure to check out all the other incredible projects being incubated with Midnight Oil Collective at this time. And as always, tune in next week to hear about more discussions about the contemporary opera world featuring our favorite opera scholars and composers. You know, the people who are actually doing the thing. Lots of love, y'all.
This podcast episode was produced by Connor O'Toole.